Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much, Giovanni, for inviting me to Turin. This is my first time to this city, actually, even though, as you are saying previously, I've been to Lake Como, Milan many times. So I'm very privileged to be here. But I'm also privileged to be speaking to you about Europe and Africa. And I don't have a PowerPoint, but I did that deliberately because I want you to listen to me and to follow my presentation rather than following a PowerPoint.
And take pictures of the slides. Yeah.
So what I thought I would do is, I think the key element in my presentation is Europe and Africa in the age of uncertainties. So what I'm going to do at the very end of my presentation is to speak about what those uncertainties are, to speak about what are the big challenges that confront Africa and Europe in this day and age. But I thought I would start by simply speaking about how I came into studying Europe and Africa. So I'll give you a bit of my background, specifically in why I was interested in Europe and Africa. And then secondly, what I'll do is to give you my big thesis about what I think about Africa-Europe relations. And in discovering, or rather in articulating my thesis, I'll be talking about the power of regionalism, which is that Europe and Africa are united by the very fact that they are both trying to build regional institutions. So that's really my message to you. Even as I come back to the discussion of the current uncertainties in the relationship, I'll be focusing primarily on how do we overcome those uncertainties through more regional integration, particularly in Africa, where regional integration is very weak. And I'm going to put the thesis, therefore, that the major contribution of Europe to Africa is through the idea around how can Africa build strong, steady regional institutions. So that's really what I'm going to talk about. So how did I get interested in Africa-Europe relations? I was doing my PhD at the Johns Hopkins University in Washington, D.C. And during my preliminary coursework, I did a class on negotiations. And my professor at that time is a professor of international negotiations. Maybe some of you have come across him. His name is William Zartman. And he was my mentor, and we worked together throughout my PhD. But in this course on negotiations, he asked me to do a paper on the negotiations between Europe and Africa. The Lome Conventions. If you're familiar with the Lome Conventions, these were the negotiations, trade and investment negotiations between Africa and Europe, starting from 1975 into actually 1990. So, but this was around 86, so he asked me to do a paper on the comparative study of the Lome 1 and the Lome 2. After I did that paper, I was interested, therefore, in how to broaden my study of Europe beyond just the Lome agreements. I said, how can I become an expert on this area? And I also was forced, William Zartman himself had written a big study on the politics of trade negotiations between Africa and Europe, Africa and the EEC, and this is a study that came out in 1971. So he was looking primarily at how do weak states negotiate with strong states. So that was the message of the book, and he encouraged me, therefore, to take up that mantle of how, subsequent to his book in 71, what is happening on the Europe-Africa horizon, and therefore how can I continue the discussion on how Europe and Africa are building their relationships. So after I finished my PhD in 1990, and my PhD was not on Europe and Africa, my PhD was on security in Southern Africa in the 70s. So after I finished my PhD, then I went into the discussion more frontally around the question, what is the EU-Africa relation? How can the two continents, in fact, work together? What holds them together and what holds them apart? So I started as one of my areas of research, therefore, to build from my paper that I wrote when I was doing coursework to then my research on Europe-Africa relations. So over the years, over the last 30 years, I occasionally write about Europe and Africa. It is not my main area of research, but I've found that over the years it helps me to revisit the question that I'll be talking to you about. So what drove my deepening interest in EU-Africa relations? What is my puzzle? What is my thesis about EU-Africa relations? My thesis, therefore, is simple. Beyond trade, beyond investment relationships, I think we need to begin to understand in a very comprehensive manner how the historical relations between Africa and Europe have evolved. So I describe Euro-African relations as one of the most lasting relationships, one of the most long-standing relationships. So it's very interesting not just to understand the very narrow trade, investment, security issues. I think we need to couch it in a much more broader historical context. So that's what I've been doing. And what also attracts me to this topic is that you have two continents that have very historically close relationships. But these relationships are also very contentious. So in fact, there are two contrasting visions that I'm going to present about Africa and Europe. So the first vision is a vision of a very checkered history, a very contested colonial history. And we always need to put it on the table, that colonialism shaped the character of Africa-Europe relationships. So that's one of the components. The second component is Africa-European relations are characterized by subjugation and exploitation. And that also, because we are adults here, we have to say there is a history of subjugation and there is a history of exploitation that characterizes these relationships. So that when we come to the discussions around aid, around European commitment to Africa in the current context, we have to keep in mind that whole broader history of exploitation and subjugation. This relationship is also characterized in very contrasting manner by the debates between paternalism and partnerships. If you do the reading on the literature, you see policymakers talking about partnerships. EU-Africa relation is a relationship around partnerships. But on the other hand, if you do more reading, you also see partnership is also very much clearly contested by the notion of paternalism. And a lot of Africans complain. If you go to Brussels, you talk to the African diplomats there, they'll say, no, we are here representing Africa, the EU, at the seat of the EU in Brussels, but nobody listens to us. Europe still treats us as a paternal, in paternalistic terms. So that element of paternalism, therefore, still very much characterizes the relationship. This is a relationship that is contrasted between geographical proximity. Africa is very close to Europe geographically. On the other hand, Africa and Europe are very far apart. So the notion of distance is there, even though we can also speak more creatively about some parts of Europe are only 80 miles away from Africa. So how do we therefore establish how do we square that cycle between distance and proximity? The other component, the bigger theme around Africa and Europe is there is a tension between expectations and false promises. I think when we look at the relationship in general, we'll be saying, what are the expectations about these relationships? How have these expectations been articulated over the years? On the other hand, are these expectations actually realistic? Or are most of these expectations simply false promises? So I think we need to probe that question. And finally, I think the bigger thesis around Africa-Europe relation is the tension between amity. There's a lot of goodwill, amity in contrast to animosity. There are a lot of animosities between the two. So how do we balance the tension between amity and animosity that have always characterized that relation? So some of my bigger conceptual themes are centered around how, over the years, the two continents have tried to square the circle, to reconcile those contrasting images and expectations and so on. My more critical point that I want to share with you is the point that I said from the outset. I want to characterize the relationship between Europe and Africa as that of the learning power of regionalism. The learning power of regionalism, and I'll build that as we keep going. So as I took more interest in the politics of regional integration, and we've just been talking about the centrality of regional integration, I found out that I think what holds Africa and Europe together is the search, very normative search, very institutional search for integrative solutions to common problems. And I have always liked integration because I always believe regional integration is a way of the future. And in fact, I'm going to argue here that you can't think about Africa unless you're thinking about it in regional terms. So the learning from each other around regional integration, to me, is therefore a powerful message, because it says very simply, neighbors have to work together. And it comes really from the old Aristotelian notion of self-sufficiency. Nations can never be self-sufficient unless they work together. And that's the key thesis about regional integration. The closer you are, the more you have to work together. The more you have to own each other's problems, the more you have to own each other's successes. So the power of regionalism, I think, is what holds Africa and Europe together. Europe embarked on the process of integration in 1957 through the Treaty of Rome. And the Treaty of Rome was a very good innovation, because what it did say is that the problems of post-war reconstruction in Europe, the problems of peace building in Europe, could not actually occur without the gradual building of institutions around functionalism, around gradualism, but also around the notion of common purpose. So that is the spirit of 1957 that gave us the EEC into what we now have as a European Union. And Jean Monnet, in fact, the architect of that process, I saw it very clearly as a gradual attempt to cede sovereignty to bigger institutions in Europe. And that was the future. 1957, only 60 years ago, the notion was we cannot work together if we are not ceding sovereignty to some of these functional institutions that we see now in Brussels. So I've always been convinced, therefore, that despite the profound differences between Europe and Africa, the power of regionalism remains, I think, one of the most appropriate European exports to Africa. And I'm saying this because there's a lot of debate about, how can Africa emulate European institutions? Why should it be doing that? My argument is not a question of emulation. My argument is that Europe, the integrity process in Europe was sufficiently robust to inspire regionalism in other places. But particularly given the geographical proximity of Africa, therefore it was important that we keep coming back to what is Europe's contribution to regional integration in Africa. And I'll explain as we go along why I think that is an important message to keep coming back to. Equally significant, learning from regionalism and integration in Europe has always been an interesting puzzle because it coincides with Africa's own visions about its own future. If you read the discussions around integration in Africa, they all revolve around the notion of Pan-Africanism, an entity larger than the nation state. And this is from 1945, before African countries got their independence. They met in Manchester and started to think about, after decolonization, how do we as Africans begin to build larger political houses? So the spirit of Pan-Africanism is essentially the spirit of integration, that Africa is not going to hang together if they don't work together. So when I talk about Europe, Europe inspiring Africa, but I'm also saying Europe is essentially building on the inspirational spirit that existed within Africa on integration. The issues around gradual learning to work together. Why am I insisting that the power of learning for integration is the most significant component of EU-Africa relations? And there are 3 points I want to make, why I put that point on the table. The first one is, through all these conventions, the Yaoundé Convention, the Lomé Convention, the Cotonou Agreements, these are agreements between Africa and Europe from 1958, essentially, until 1990. All these agreements underscored the fact that Africa was dependent on Europe, for the most part, in building regional integration schemes. So if you look at those agreements, their key point is that Europe is going to help Africans build their own regional institutions. Going to be trade-based, going to be development-based, but the larger objective is how to, in fact, build strong regional institutions in Africa. And so the EU, the EEC, in the 60s and 70s, began to engage in institutions like the East African Community in East Africa, the Southern African Development Community in Southern Africa, ECOWAS, Economic Community of West African States. These were institutions that were funded largely by the Europeans with the objective of, in the long run, building the capacity of African countries to begin to do things efficiently. And they could only do that within the regional frameworks of the SADC, the EAC, and there are many, IGAD and so on. But even before these countries got their independence, a lot of the colonial powers had invested in regional institutions. And if you do the readings in East Africa, for instance, you see that the British were already building regional institutions among the key countries of Kenya, Uganda, and Tanzania, way before independence. They had a customs union. They had a monetary union in East Africa in the 20s. Why? The thesis was these countries are not going to be independent if they work separately. They have to work together. If you go to Central Africa, there was a Central African Union of Rhodesia, Northern Rhodesia, and Southern Rhodesia. That's now the currently Zimbabwe and Zambia. If you go down to South Africa had one of the first regional integration scheme, 1910. The South African Customs Union was created by the British in 1910. Why? Again, because of the spirit of regionalism that was informing the discussions around Africa, or the future of Africa is in regional integration scheme. So therefore that it has been important for Africa, for Europe. Europe has always supported regional integration schemes, and I think that's one of the bigger argument. The problem, however, is that in Africa, since independence, there have been conflicts about how you define regionalism. There is one school of thought from the 60s that simply said regional integration schemes in Africa are going to be based on the sub-regional frameworks that were established by colonialism. So that in East Africa, as I mentioned, they already had the East African community. In Central Africa, they already had the Central African Federation. After independence, the debate was, should Africa therefore focus on regional integration scheme within sub-regional context or within the larger continental context? And that debate has not disappeared. I'm just putting it to you so that you have a sense that even Africans are conflicted about the geography of regionalism. Some people believe you can't really be building a continental framework of regional integration because the continent is too huge. It is too diverse. There is no synergy, there is no chemistry between Mauritania and Swaziland because they live too far apart. So what you need to do, therefore, in building regional integration scheme is you have to focus on the sub-regional context. So I think that's one of the points. But this is a point that should be left for Africans, in fact, to begin to exhaustively talk about what do they mean by regionalism. But the point I'm making is that Europe has been at the center of supporting the wave of integration in Africa. The other point I want to make about Europe's support for integration as the more important component of the relationship is to say regional integration in Africa is the only exit option for Europe. If Europe doesn't support integration in Africa, it is not going to leave Africa. I mean, in that bigger sense, that the more there is support for integration, the more Europe has an opportunity to say, we are not going to manage African issues anymore. Africans have reached a stage where they can, in fact, begin to run their own affairs. But they can't run their own affairs if they are not running those affairs within the context of regional institutions. And that's why the thesis is very simple. Support regional integration in Africa so that you are not permanently engaged in African issues. And I'll come back to that when I quickly look at issues around security and so on. In fact, one of the most interesting issues around economic partnership agreements between Africa and Europe, which have been stalled because of so many reasons, is Europe is asking African countries to choose who belongs to what institution. And it is important to ask that question because there are many African countries that belong to so many regional organizations, and it's not very helpful. And that is a debate within Africa. Tanzania, for instance, belongs to the East African community. But Tanzania also belongs to the Southern African Development Community. So there is a question, therefore, of where do you actually make more traction? So those debates around the EPA, the economic partnership arrangements, have been good debates because they're asking African countries to literally choose who should be cooperating with Europe, who should be working with Europe. Can't be everybody it can't be many countries in too many regional organizations. So I think that's the point I'm making, that regional integration is important for Africa in the long run. I had an article I wrote this year, in January, in a Council for Foreign Relations, which is a research institution in Washington, and it's called Regional Integration for Democratization and Conflict Resolution. And I made the point that Africa has the weakest regional institutions in the world. But these institutions are more needed than anywhere else, which is a contradiction. They are weaker, but they are more needed than anywhere else, largely because, again, the trend around regionalization, Africans need to work together to build, in fact, a sense of regional community. So I'm still pitching the point that these institutions are weak, but we should actually give them more energy. We should give them more room, and I think that's the future for Africa. My other point about regionalism is to say there has been a lot of learning from Europe on how to build effective regional integrations. The only problem over the last years is you have in Europe, you have Brexit. Brexit is a danger not only to the European context around the discussions on regional integration, but it also has an impact on African integration to the extent that, in fact, it dampens the spirit of integration in Africa. And that's why I think immediately after Brexit, you had a lot of discussions in Africa. East Africa, for instance, wanted to have a common monetary union. Kenya, Uganda, Tanzania, Rwanda, and Burundi. They are moving towards a monetary union. But when Brexit happened, then they began to say, is this going to work really? But they were trying really to go back to the earlier days of colonial days when they had one common currency in the larger Eastern Africa. So these debates were not actually very new debates. It was therefore an attempt to, in fact, look at the issues around a single currency within the larger Eastern Africa. And that was dampened by Brexit. Let me now go to what I'm calling, what are the contemporary challenges? What are the nagging problems in Africa-Europe relations? I'm speaking more directly, therefore. When we talk about the age of uncertainty, what do we actually mean? And I've alluded to some of the things, but I thought I'd speak more frontally on what are the key elements of problems in Africa-Europe relations. I think the first one I've already hinted at is the negotiations for the economic partnership arrangements. For those of you who don't know, these economic partnership arrangements were supposed to take over from the Cotonou Agreement, which was signed a few years ago and is expiring in 2020. This is the relationship, the agreement that holds Africa in the trade, investment, and public policy dialogues. So what you need now, what Europe said, is that we need new agreements between African countries and the EU. And these are the agreements that then have been negotiated over the years. The issue around the EPS is that they are non-reciprocal. What means that African countries, they used to receive a lot of concessions before in trade relationships, but now the EPAs are going to force African countries to open their markets to European commodities. And that is the contentious issue because Africans feel they are not sufficiently strong economically to allow their economies and to open up their economies to European products. So the EPAs have been a very important contentious area within Africa-EU relations. Before Brexit, there are few sub-regions in Africa that had already made some progress on signing these EPAs with some European countries. But after Brexit, in fact, some people began to say, no, how can we sign EPAs with Europe? And we really don't know the Europe we are going to sign up with. We don't know whether the EU is going to be there in 20 years. I mean, that's probably exaggerated, but it speaks to the issues around African countries feeling less willing to sign agreements with the EU in the context of uncertainties in Europe itself. The second issue that is of contentions between Africa and Europe is the question about Europe's engagement in African security and peacekeeping arenas. I think since 2007, when Africa and Europe agreed on a framework called a Joint Africa-EU strategy, the framework simply said, these are two continents that have worked together for many years. These are continents that should continue to work together, particularly in helping African countries overcome some of the bigger problems of security and stabilization. So there has been, in fact, a very proactive European engagement in African security through the African Peace Fund, Peace Facility. Europe has been contributing close to about 2.6 billion euros in peacekeeping, stabilization, peacemaking, all these problems that we associate with the bad side of Africa. The conflict-ridden side of Africa. But these engagements have raised bigger questions about whether, in fact, security collaboration is making any difference on the ground. The EU has been supporting the African Union mission in Somalia for many years now, helping the African Union, in fact, to contribute to the stabilization of Somalia. The question now is, how stable is Somalia? When will Somalia be stable? And you can say the same thing about EU's engagement in the Sahel. Sahel has been on fire for many years. And the question is a lot of European engagement around stabilization in the Sahel, around the Lake Chad region, the Boko Haram area, Nigeria, Chad, and Niger, and so on. So the question is, even though Europe has put in quite sufficient resources in Africa's stabilization, peacekeeping, and so on, there is not really much to show for it. And we have to be very open that, in fact, there isn't much to show for it, because these are very protracted conflicts. These are conflicts that may be generational. We should not be thinking about resolving some of these conflicts in the next 2-3 years. We should be thinking the long term. The problem with the long term, however, is where is the money going to come from? So one of the key irritants in EU-Africa relations is the question of money. The EU is tired of being treated like an ATM by African countries, especially when it comes to issues around peace and security. They don't want to be a cash machine. Yet, I think the discussions about sustainability has led to very good discussions in Africa about how to generate their own resources for peace building, for peacemaking, and for conflict resolution. So just over the last 3 or 4 years, there has been very good discussion in Africa about how African countries can come up with their own revenues for funding peacekeeping efforts. So that the EU probably down the road, if African countries succeed, what they have decided is that African countries are going to charge 0.2% on imports, a tax on imports coming into Africa. There is no real good consensus on how that is going to work. But the spirit is that if you charge imports coming into Africa 0.2% tax, it will generate sufficient revenues to actually build the African resources for peace building and peacemaking. So the figure is that they're estimated to come up with about 1.2 billion a year from that tax levy. And Europe has supported it because it's actually going to help in the debates around who pays for African security, because Europe is not interested in doing that anymore. The other initiative is African countries have proposed that by the year 2020, they'll be paying 25% of peacekeeping efforts on the continent. So instead of asking the EU to go to Mali, at least Africans would have some of the resources, and then they can go to the UN and embarrass the UN and tell the UN, we have some pot of money on peacekeeping. Why can't you ask the rest of the so-called international community to chip in, so that it doesn't look like it's an entirely European enterprise? My proposal is very simple here. In the next 20 years, I propose that Europe should get out of peacekeeping and peace stabilization missions in Africa. And it's a point that stems from my initial thesis around African ownership of African problems through regional integration. So if Europe can announce that in the next 10 to 15 years they're not going to pay any cent on peacekeeping and peacemaking in Africa, particularly peacekeeping, actually, peacemaking is not too bad. If they can make that announcement, what it will do, it will focus attention in Africa to conflict prevention. Because a lot of the countries that are facing the peacekeeping regimes, the DRC, Chad, Mali, Somalia, these are failed states. But we cannot continue to subsidize state failure. So the point is, it will focus attention within African countries on, in fact, how do we prevent the collapse of states? And it's a very new paradigm, therefore, in thinking about, we can't be thinking about Africa all the time in terms of peacekeeping, in terms of fire brigades, especially by the EU. So the debate, therefore, is that how then do we begin, in fact, to invest more in institutions of conflict prevention, in institutions of early warning? How do we begin, in fact, to invest in institutions of governance? These are the institutions that are going to prevent the lapse into peacekeeping mentalities and modalities. So that's why I'm suggesting zero funding in the next 10 years to African peacekeeping efforts, particularly by the EU. And I think if that announcement is made, it's sufficient, gives Africans sufficient time to begin to mobilize resources to end these wars. In fact, one of the Africa's Agenda 2063 says Africa pledges to end wars by 2020. So it's within the African horizon to begin thinking about how to end wars and therefore prevent the discussion around who should be funding peacekeeping and so on. The other major problem in Africa-Europe relations is, of course, the issue of migration. And I think being from here, you understand it better because Italy has been very involved in the bigger debates around the Mediterranean. So the question, therefore, has become, how does Africa and Europe have a broad-based debate around the contentious issue of migration? And by broad-based debate, I'm saying the debate has been very one-sided. You have Africans on the one hand coming up with essentially an argument that says Europe should be more responsive. Europe should be more respectful of African positions on migration. Europe, on the other hand, has steadfastly argued that in fact they're not very much interested in migrants from Africa. And I'm just putting it in a broader sense. Europe has militarized, Europe has securitized the migration regime. And that's why we see institutions like Frontex, the military in North Africa, around the Mediterranean, trying to get these barbarians out, stop them from coming to Europe. That's the vision. That's the securitized vision of Europe. At the Malta conference, there was a conference in Malta between Africa and Europe on that issue of migration. And there was no real consensus about what needs to be done. I think the EU came up with some money. It says, we need to give you enough resources. We need to give you some resources so that, in fact, you can deal with the root causes of that problem on your own territories. I think that was the position. Some African countries, however, feel that a securitized version of immigration is not going to work. And I think they point to the US-Mexico side of the puzzle on migration. Unless you build a wall around the Mediterranean, you probably are not going to have any traction on that issue of migration. So I think what we've come back to now is a discussion around where do we seek consensus. And in Africa, therefore, the debate around migration centered around two propositions. One is that Europe should be more willing to allow legal migration from Africa. Europe should not hide from the fact that legal migration from Africa is important for Europe, particularly in the context of aging populations in Europe. And I was just reading a story the other day, actually last week. The Japanese have changed their national legislation to begin to allow migrants to Japan, again for the same purpose, that as the aging populations become larger, the older populations become larger, Japan will have to bring in more migrants, legal migrants. And that's a first in history, because Japan is one of the more insular countries around migration. So the point that some African countries are putting across the table is why can't we therefore have more skilled labor from Africa? Why is Europe only interested in taking footballers from Africa? Why can't they begin to think about other bigger skills and other more interesting skills to bring here? That's the point. The second point is that money that has been funding so-called root causes, that means unemployment, hopelessness in Africa, to preempt migration, is not sufficient. So there was the discussion therefore after Malta that Europe has to dig deeper into its passes to come up with the money for root causes. Dealing with unemployment in Gambia, for instance. A lot of the migrants here are from Gambia and Senegal. How can, in fact, Europe do more to strengthen that component? The other point that Africans have been making consistently, and you should read up on this, 70 to 80% of migration is within Africa. There are more Nigerians in South Africa. Or rather, there's movement within Africa that is huger, larger than people who are crossing the Mediterranean. So the argument is that there are not many Africans who want to go to Europe. There are many Africans who want to go down south. There are more Ethiopians who want to go to South Africa, Malawi, than Ethiopians who want to come to Europe. So those are some of the debates around what needs to happen. Let me begin to conclude quickly by just reiterating some of the issues that I've talked about. And I think what I want to say is that despite the uncertainties in these relationships have come to a stage where I call the age of maturity. I think Africa and European relations are in the age of maturity because I think since the late 90s, there's been more discussions about what are the expectations about these relationships. And Europe has been saying, we don't want an Africa that has too much expectations about Europe. I think that's one point to put to the table. The second point is the age of maturity coincides with the growth in other actors within Africa. So you have the Chinese in Africa, and they are playing an interesting role that Europe did play before. Or they are playing roles that Europe never really wanted to play before. So that component of the Chinese engagement with Africa gives Africa, quote unquote, some latitude in negotiating the old debates about this partnership. And so we have to put right to the table that Africa and Europe are more mature, so that even as they get into uncertainties, when you are mature enough, you can actually listen to each other, you can shout at each other, but I think there is an element of understanding. The other component of maturity is that there are a lot of institutional reforms that are now happening in Africa, especially around the African Union. The African Union was created in 2002, but the African Union has been doing too many things. So I think there is a reform momentum within Africa that how do we focus African institutions? Because if you focus these institutions, it means they won't really need a lot of resources from outside. So Paul Kagame from Rwanda, who is leading the AU reform agenda, has argued that in fact the AU should be very lean institutions, because Africans should be focusing on more bread and butter issues. They should be focusing on issues around, this year only they unveiled the common free trade area for Africa. And that is now the in thing, in the sense that Africa should begin to focus on more economic integration schemes that hold these countries together, that unite them, rather than the fixation with security and peacekeeping. These are issues that, in fact, divide these countries. So the reform agenda, therefore, is there on the table as part of the maturity. And I think the other point that I think we should put in place here, Germany is taking an increasingly important role in African affairs. And I think that is going to be, in fact, strengthened more when you see Brexit, if it does happen as it's supposed to happen. I think Theresa May is supposed to give a program today. So I don't know whether there's going to be a shift in Euro-African relations when you have Germany, a formerly non-colonial power, actually leading on African issues. And it's going to be a very interesting dynamic, because she's come up with a lot of initiatives, the Marshall Plan with Africa, the Compact with Africa, and these are issues where Germany is trying to say the best way to engage with Africa is to engage with Africa around economic development issues. Private enterprise, entrepreneurship, things that are much, much better and much more manageable, much easier to sell to the European taxpayers than if you tell them you want to go and fund peacekeeping in Somalia. So there is, I think, a change in the tone, a change in the leadership around these issues. And I think I've spoken too much, so I should stop here and take some questions.
Okay, so thank you very much, Gilbert. Let's open the floor immediately to your questions or comments as you wish. Okay, so we don't have, I'm sorry that we don't have the flying microphone in this room, but we will manage. Okay, so there is a question or comment there, if right? Yeah?
often referred to as a successful story by many scholars, and also the European Union is presenting it as a mission that is worth being replicated, let's say, in other countries. Do you think it's the case? And I will anticipate if you disagree with that, if you consider it didn't bring Somalia any closer to security. Do you think, why do you think the EU is pushing this type of mission as a successful one?
See, we can, or we can collect some questions. If there, yes, a question here.
Hello, Professor. Thank you for your presentation, and I have a question. In your presentation,
sorry, but
Can you stand up?
yes, can you stand up? Yes, and be silent there. Otherwise,
But I can also repeat the question.
yeah. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
and my question is, in your presentation, you said that China having a different role beside Europe in Africa. So, my question is, what is the role of the Chinese government to take part in and influence in Africa? Thank you.
I think we were waiting for this question. Okay. No, because it is. Yes, there is another question there.
Good afternoon. I wanted to ask what prevents Africa to have a stronger a stronger African Union, just like Europe has. You mentioned the Treaty of Rome in 1957. Now it's been a long path for Europe. Although African countries have started to gain their independence in the 60s, so they have started to be actually independent. So why don't they have stronger African Union as the European Union? What are the factors that influence this? Thanks.
Another one there.
Yeah. The question is about the possibility to coexist between the different types of cooperation. We can say cooperation between EU and Africa, but also China, Africa, but also with other states like the emerging powers, but already powers like Japan, but also United States. When we talk about Liberia all these bilateral cooperation can coexist in only one region. How can they develop together a better future for Africa?
Thank you for your lecture. Of course, I was wondering whether you think that Africa should also get out of the health system that, of course, Europe is kind of providing with the Doctors Without Borders and things like that, because you said that we should no longer be involved in peacekeeping efforts.
Yes.
First of all, thank you for the lecture, Khadiagala. My question regards the course of regional integration in Africa. First of all, first question regards the African Union. Could you name the countries which hinder the process of regional integration through the African Union? And could you name the countries, African countries which hinder the process of regional integration in general, let's say, today? What method, let's say, of regional integration in Africa do you like more? The method of of integration through one single organization, such as the African Union, or integration through different organizations, so-called spaghetti effect, in Africa, where are
Spaghetti bowl.
yeah, spaghetti bowl, yeah. And there are a lot of regional integration organizations such as ECOWAS, etc. So which method is best? What method is best?
Can I tackle those and then we'll come back to you? There was a question on Somalia, which is how do we evaluate EU's engagement with Somalia, particularly with respect to the issue of stabilization and EU's training? my reading of it is that the EU came in at a very desperate moment when the African Union could not manage the Somali problem. And the Somali problem is a regional problem. So somebody needed to do something about returning Somalia to stability. So when the African Union went in, it started on a very small scale, but it needed the support. So the EU did an excellent job in actually providing that kind of initial support around Somalia when Somalia needed it, when the IGAD region, Ethiopia, Kenya needed it. So I'm not trivializing that role. What I'm saying is that now Somalia is being engaged in very difficult issues around Al-Shabaab, around countering terrorism in that area. It's an area that transcends the issues around building state capacity in Somalia. I'm saying it's a long-term process. And I don't know whether the EU has the stomach to stay the course. That's really the point about, I'm applauding what the EU has done now, but I'm a bit worried that if it's only the EU, we are not going to make any traction in the stabilization of Somalia. So, and you see Al-Shabaab every week. There's a huge bombing in Somalia. There was just one over the weekend. And these are issues everybody says, I mean, there is a government in Mogadishu that is doing good things, but the longer run issues around Al-Shabaab and terrorism and so on, I'm saying these should be international problems where the resources are going to come from multiple sources. And the Horn of Africa itself is a region in trouble. And it should not be left to the EU alone to deal with that problem. And I mean, in other places I've proposed an UN peacekeeping in Somalia. But nobody can buy that idea because, I mean, it's terrible. It's a terrible, and there's a huge engagement. So the question therefore, how do you balance between the small successes that we have achieved in Somalia with a long-term process of international engagement around what remains a very, very difficult problem? And I think the EU can contribute to that. And that's why I'm talking about a 10-15-year timetable for the EU to begin to rethink its security engagement. Maybe after 10 years, maybe Somalia will be better. After 10 years, maybe Mali will be stabilized. So the bigger questions around sustainability, particularly of peacekeeping efforts in Africa, I think is my bigger concern. On China, the point I was making was simple, that Africa has more alternatives in terms of external partners, and therefore China is a new entrant in an area that was previously the preserve of the EU and the rest of, and the Americans, for instance. So China's engagement, for instance, around infrastructure, this is something that the EU should have been doing from day one. I mean, everybody talks about infrastructure deficits in Africa. And then China says, yeah, we are going to give you money to build infrastructure. So the Chinese component is a component that says, gives Africa some alternatives. But again, Africans would have ultimately to decide what they want to do. I mean, they'll have to own their engagements with the rest of the Africa. China gives them another option. And there are many debates now around whether the Chinese option is the best option.
So
if you what?
The new role of the China in Africa, because you said they have a different role as Europe in Africa. So what's the new role in China?
They started by infrastructure development. That was the first. But now the Chinese are moving into security issues. They are into the peacekeeping in Mali.
Yeah.
They are into peacekeeping in South Sudan. So gradually, the Chinese are going to look like the Europeans. I mean, in the sense that they are going to go into areas that have been traditionally the areas of the Europeans. But previously we thought they are only interested in infrastructure, in trade and so on. Yeah. So, but it's an interesting dimension. The question on what prevents Africa, the African Union, from being a robust institution like the EU. And there are two explanations. One, and it fits actually to your question also, where should you focus in Africa if you want to build regional institutions? There's a lot of focus on the continental institutions, but I argued from the beginning that that's not a more productive area of engagement. The AU, the OAU, these are mega institutions. They don't do much, they can't do much, they won't have enough resources. So investing in these institutions at the continental level is not as effective. And that's why I mentioned at the end, the Kagame report on the AU's reform says we should have a very small AU. Why? Because the efforts in integration in Africa should be focused on the sub-regional level. It makes sense to invest in economic community of West African states because those countries are very close to each other. They know each other very well, and they can work more effectively because of geographical proximity than if you're talking the continental level. So the answer to the question is that there has been fixation with the continental institution building at the expense of sub-regional institutions. So that's one answer to that. But the spaghetti ball is also a crisis because too many countries are members of too many regional institutions. And as I mentioned from the outset, if you build institutions around the spaghetti ball model, that's anarchy. That's not building regional institutions. That's just countries just hopping from one regional institution to the other. Very recently, Burundi is a member of the East African community. Burundi is very far away from Southern Africa. Burundi applied to SADC. And then the SADC country said, no, we don't want Burundi to come to SADC because you already belong to East Africa. That's your home. What are you going to do in SADC? But Comoros also applied to SADC. Comoros is very far in the Indian Ocean. So SADC said, yeah, let's get Comoros as a member of SADC. And I've argued that that's a mistake. Because, again, if you bring Comoros into the SADC, you are inheriting political problems, security baggage in Comoros. And Comoros now is in trouble because the president is trying to change the constitution. So the SADC countries will have to spend a lot of time trying to resolve conflicts in Comoros. Because Comoros is now a member of SADC. They should just have told Comoros, why don't you just stay in the Indian Ocean rim? There's already an institution there. So the question, therefore, is that African countries have to choose where they want to belong to avoid these multiple memberships. Again, the debate around how do you rationalize. And it's expensive to be a member of two regional institutions. And some of these countries can't even pay their dues to the African Union. So why are they joining too many institutions? So the debate is that we have to be serious in Africa about regional institutions. And the more serious ones are the more localized ones, not the AU. So that's how I want to answer the question. There was an interesting question on trilateralism. There are many actors who should be involved in helping Africa to deal with some of its bigger problems, whether we are talking about health, security, development, and so on. And the trilateral formula is a very good formula because it says you could have key leading partners like China working with the US, working with the Japanese in the stabilization of South Sudan. I mean, South Sudan is in trouble, and it should not be left to the EU. It should not be left to the Americans. You can have very creative kinds of international engagements around trilateralism. And that's why the key, South Sudan is a good case, where there is a Chinese engagement, there is potentially a Japanese engagement, but also EU and so on, to help local actors gradually build their capacity to do these things on their own in future, because that's the key. It should not be a permanent engagement. Djibouti, if you read about Djibouti, you see you have the Japanese in Djibouti, you have South Koreans, you have the Americans, you have the Chinese. But because Djibouti is of strategic significance, so that engagement is a bit different. On the health issue, though, I haven't made a case for international disengagement from the health arena. And I think the EU and all these actors have been supporting, in fact, civil society actions and engagement within those countries. I mean, Ebola is a problem in the DRC. And that problem cannot just be left to the DRC or the regional neighbors, because these countries don't even have the resources to deal with the Ebola crisis. And we saw the kind of international engagement around Ebola in Sierra Leone and Liberia only 4 years ago. And that was a very good model of how international action around an issue like health can actually make a big difference. So I'm just saying we need some tactical disengagement from areas that are not as... I'm not saying security is not important, but I'm saying the more we focus on security, the more we forget that we would not be in these security problems if we prevented those countries from going where they are. And the AU's or African countries are talking about prevention. Why should we have a Burundi where the international community spend thousands of dollars for stabilization to go back to war? Why should Burundi go back to war? And I don't think it should be the work of international actors. It should be the work of local actors to hold the Burundians together and say, how can we help you get out of this foolishness? Even the DRC, you can make the same case about the DRC. International actors spent a lot of money trying to stabilize the Congo. We should not be talking today about going back into the Congo. Kabila was at the UN in September and he said, I don't want the UN in the DRC. I want the UN to go back home. So we should be doing more in the security arena. But the other areas of engagement, I think, are going to remain very relevant for external actors. I think I answered all your questions on the AU Rex. Straightforward, I think the more investment in Africa should be at the level of regional economic integration. And those are the SADC, the ECOWAS, the East African Community. We need to do more in building a regional economic community in Central Africa, the economic community of Central African states. It hasn't done a good job. We need to do more in building North Africa. There is a regional economic community in North Africa called the Arab Maghreb Union. But the Arab Maghreb Union has been dysfunctional because the Moroccans and the Algerians don't speak to each other. I think now that Morocco is part of the EU, maybe they can start to engage the Algerians about why are we at war with each other. I mean, there is no reason why Morocco and Algeria shouldn't be speaking to each other. Even issues around Western Sahara, these are issues that can be resolved more quickly. So that's where African integration should be focused on. The continent will be there. They will have a small office in Addis Ababa coordinating some of these issues, but it's still a very small office compared to the EU. EU has more than 30,000 bureaucrats in Brussels. The AU has 1,600. So it means that the AU is not the place to be focusing on because it's too distant and it can't do its work effectively. Even if you gave it more millions, it won't be able to do it. And that's why Kagame suggested that we should cut down some of what the African Union does, give more responsibility to regional economic communities. Back to the questions.
Yeah, second round. Yes,
Right.
there's one there.
A question about the migration issue.
Yes.
Because for sure here in Europe a huge problem. And my question is about if the African countries that are pushing for regional integration have ever seen this problem as a possibility to strengthen their relations and also to get close and to avoid that a lot of people risk their lives on the borders and on the sea.
Other questions? So there is one. Sorry.
I want to thank you for the point you made up before, and you talked about sub-regionalism. So, how is the relationship between these sub-regional groups? So, ECOWAS, EAC, and SADC. Like you said before, I believe Burundi wanted to enter in SADC, and they said no. While Comoros, they said yes. So, is the competition between these sub-regional actors good for the development of Africa, or is it bad between them?
So may I jump in? Sorry, because may I jump in a little bit because I cannot resist. So no, I cannot resist because I think that you have been even too kind with Europe. Even with regards to regionalism. With regard to regionalism, that is talking about the spaghetti bowl, for example. No, you said that it is good that Europe is putting under pressure African states because they have to choose to which regional organizations take part. Yes. But don't you think that the European Union itself has contributed to fueling this kind of spaghetti bowl? That is, for example, take the ECOWAS and the UEMOA in West Africa, and so on. And on the other hand, do you think that these economic partnership agreements are contributing to solve this problem or to aggravate this problem and to make this problem worse? Yes. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Excellent. Thank you. Thank you very much. The question on migration is twofold. There are a lot of initiatives in Africa for dealing with migration issues. And in East Africa, where I come from Kenya. The East African community has a provision on regional citizenship. So you don't need permission to go and live or work in Rwanda if you're from Kenya. The free movement of labor in East Africa is a reality now. And I'm mentioning that because the free movement of labor within the East African community is critical to dealing with the issues of migration and so on. If you have a poor Burundian who doesn't have a job at home, he can migrate to Nairobi and look for a job. So there are those experiments that are actually trying to deal within Africa with the issues around migration. West Africa also has a free movement of labor within the ECOWAS region. We find a lot of Nigerians in Ghana, in Gambia, and so on and so forth. So Africa is doing enough to deal with the issue of migration. The only problem when it comes to Europe is the question of double standards. In 2015, the Syrians are accepted here with no big problem. And so the Africans are telling the Europeans, how come the Syrians can go to Europe and live there? How do you accept refugees from Syria and not refugees from Eritrea? So the issue of double standards. But the other point I was saying is that, again, even if Europe allowed legal migration from Africa, those numbers are not going to be that huge. They're not going to be that huge. And it is going to allow African countries giving them a carrot to say, we are allowing some of your people to come to Europe to work here legally. Why don't you do more to police your borders so that we don't have illegal migration? And that can be done. I mean, there could be a debate around that. So that's what that issue is all about. Is there competition between the RECs? Not really. There isn't competition between the RECs. And let me go back to Burundi again. Burundi wanted to go to Southern Africa because it was tired of being lectured on issues of governance by East Africans. So it's actually a deliberate move to escape the responsibility that Burundi itself has created for itself. The president of Burundi has created many problems for himself. So he thinks that if he goes to SADC, which is very far, he can kind of escape the kind of censure that countries like Uganda or Tanzania are putting onto it. So there is no real big problem between the RECs. I think they should be working. There is a meeting that is happening in Kigali at the end of this week where they are now going to talk about how do you better coordinate the relationship between the RECs so that they're actually working together. But the bigger point is that there isn't much competition. There should be more coordination. And that is why the meeting in Kigali will be looking at. Also, in fact, what is the relationship between the regional economic communities and the African Union? Because that relationship has not been clearly defined. There is a memorandum of understanding which was reached in 2008, but there is a feeling in Africa now that because these regional economic communities are doing more work, they should be more recognized within the larger African security and so on. So I think that's the answer to that. I think, Giovanni, you are correct that I'm being too kind to Europe, especially when it comes to regionalism. But I made 2 points that I think 60s into the 90s, Europe did make a big contribution to regional integration in Africa. And I think that was the bigger point. The second point, which I didn't avoid deliberately, but I guess the spaghetti ball problem is also because you have regional institutions that were created by some colonial powers, particularly the French, and they have never really wanted to disengage from those institutions. That's why when Nigeria in 1975 said we are going to create ECOWAS, Nigeria had the vision of a very integrated West Africa, so that even the French, the Portuguese, all could come together into one common house. But Nigeria has had trouble getting the Francophones to actually buy into ECOWAS the way Nigeria envisaged the ECOWAS in 1975. And that's because of French influence within West Africa, which everybody complains about. and I think we should be open about this, that the continuity of some of these bilateral relationships, special relationships between African countries and some European countries have really hampered integration. On the issue of EPAs and their contribution to integration, it is actually a position that takes this is a very different position, because everybody in Africa is complaining about EPAs are going to hamper African integration, making it impossible for Africans to work together. My point has always been in the very strict sense of membership around regional integration. And that's why I put the case of Tanzania. Tanzania negotiated its EPAs within East Africa, not within SADC, because Europe was saying Tanzania is a natural member of the larger East Africa rather than the larger Southern Africa. And whether that helps in the rationalization, if EPAs produces the pressures that creates more rationalized African institutions, that's good. I mean, it's a very narrow point about how you read the discussions around who belongs to what. EPAs forces these countries to choose on who should negotiate with Europe. So that's my limited case. But again, there is very good evidence that African countries have resisted the economic partnership agreements because a lot of them are going to be very deleterious to their economies. They are going to hamper integration, some forms of integration in Africa. And we have to say that's a reality that we have to deal with. But Europe, I think, does understand that they will have to deal with that issue, because it will still keep coming back to how are you relating with Africa? Which Africa are you actually relating to? And that's why it has taken a long time for the EPAs to become conventional wisdom.
Okay. So thank you very much, Gilbert. Our time is over, I think. Yes, time is over. So thank you very much. Thank you very much. Very interesting for all of us.